Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming this evening. It's really my pleasure to kick off our seminar series for the School of International and Public Affairs, the Urban and Social Policy Concentrations, by introducing to everyone quite an extraordinary person who has both an extraordinary history of government service as well as activism in the community, and somebody who's a problem solver. Maybe that's the biggest compliment I can give you.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to be a problem creator, too.
Yeah, he's the problem creator. I could say that from personal experience. But Joel Berg, who is the author of How Hungry is America, is going to speak this evening to us on his book.
Actually, full title's All You Can Eat, How Hungry is America.
All You Can Eat. It's a clever title, and I screwed that up.
Yeah.
So let's make sure I get that right. All You Can Eat, How Hungry is America. Joel, as you probably know, is a nationally recognized leader in the field of hunger and food security. And he currently is the executive director of the New York City Coalition Against Hunger. I had the pleasure of working with him when I was at City Hall. And he does hold everyone's feet to the fire. I think, New York City is lucky to have you here, frankly. He came to New York after spending 8 years in the Clinton administration in a variety of senior positions at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And specifically for 2 years, he worked as the community coordinator of community food security for the USDA. What I have to add to his resume, and was delighted to find out, is that Joel is a 1986 graduate of Columbia College, and he grew up in Rockland County, New York, which, for those of you who don't know, is one of our northern suburbs, and managed to find his way to New York City. So I always find that impressive when suburban kids end up in New York City. We're really delighted that you could come this evening, Joel, and talk to us about your book and also about the policy initiatives that you've been engaging in, both here in New York City and nationally.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fuchs, for the invitation to be here. Thank you guys for coming. I did a lot of things right when I was an undergraduate here. I spent a lot of time at Postscript and heard a lot of great music, went to all the right protests. I was involved in the protest to get to Columbia to divest its investments from South Africa. And people at the time said, opponents of that, Nelson Mandela was a dangerous communist who would bring revolution to South Africa. So I was right on that score. I have to say, in retrospect, I made two grievous mistakes while I was here. One, when I was a freshman, I did not figure out some way, shape, or form to get to know senior Barack Obama. And two, I took inferior political science courses and did not take Dr. Fuchs' urban affairs course. So those are two mistakes that will haunt me for life. But I will somehow, muddle through despite that. I want to start out with a sort of secular parable, if I might, and ask you to imagine that this is not 2009, but ask you to imagine this is the mid-1800s. And I want you to come visit me down by where my office is now on Beaver Street, near the Wall Street area. This is pretty much, I guess, Dutch farmland at the time. The Bloomingdale Insane Asylum, which was here before Columbia. I don't think it had been built yet. So come visit me, down by Wall Street. And what would you see in the mid-1830s? And around there, and particularly in the Five Points neighborhood, you'd see people dying right and left of yellow fever. It was a ghastly disease you're eating, so I won't describe. Did I say yellow fever? I meant yellow fever was in the 1790s. I'd say that was a horrible disease, but cholera was in the mid-1800s. People were dying everywhere of cholera, and it was a ghastly disease. It happened most frequently in low-income neighborhoods, and there was a great exhibit on the history of cholera at the New York Historic Society a few years ago. That's how I relax, go to cholera exhibitions. And there were letters from the elites of New York basically saying the reason this disease happened most prominently in low-income neighborhoods is because God was purposely punishing poor people for their sins of being poor. They were lewd, they were lascivious, they were lazy. Suppose if you transposed it to the elites of today, they don't grow all their food themselves and cook it from scratch. And that's why low-income people had cholera. And the working assumption at the time was the only way we could possibly address this at all, is we couldn't cure it, was that maybe we could have a little extra charity to make people's lives marginally less miserable as they died a horrible, inevitable death. And people just believed this stuff was a natural part of the of the world environment. They thought it was like the Hudson River or the Catskills. They thought it would sort of disease had always been here, always will be, and that was that. Now, quick show of hands. And by the way, the cholera death rate in New York was so great in the 1830s, 1 year. If you transposed it to New York City today, it would equal more than 100,000 people dying a year. So you could fill Madison Square Garden 5 times over where people died from cholera in the height of the epidemic. Okay, now raise your hands quick. Now, if you're in the Peace Corps overseas, I'm taking you out of this. Raise your hand if you know anyone that's ever contracted cholera, malaria, which is also common in the southern United States at the time, or yellow fever while in the United States. No one? Okay, let me expand this. Raise your hand if you've ever met anyone who's contracted yellow fever, malaria, or cholera in the United States. You know what? I never get any hands. Although once I found some joker, they had some cousin who worked at the Center for Disease Control and some mosquito, escaped, and they got a mild version of this. But by and large, these diseases are gone. You guys are in the International Affairs building here of an esteemed Ivy League institution, so no doubt you understand that these diseases are still prevalent throughout much of the rest of the world. You know they're warm weather diseases. It's a very hot day for April, further proof that the world is warming, North America is warming. So where did these diseases go? What happened to them? Why don't we have them in New York anymore? My answer, government wiped them out. Government wiped them out. Yes, that evil, horrible, occupying force government. So say the teabaggers, that horrible thing that can't do anything right, that will mess up a 2-car parade, actually solved major social problems. And I start virtually all my talks on hunger with this example for 2 reasons. Number one, the same demonstrably wrong assumptions we had then about diseases, I contend, are the same demonstrably wrong assumptions we have about poverty and hunger today. People believe they've always been here, always will be, just part of the natural environment. I contend they're man-made and women-made, and that they go up or down in human history based on what humans do or don't do. People still believe today that poor people are poor because they're irresponsible. I believe that poor people are fundamentally irresponsible, but I also believe rich people are fundamentally irresponsible. Human beings are fundamentally irresponsible. If irresponsibility was the cause of poverty, Paris Hilton would be homeless. And I don't think, that's the case. I also think human beings are fundamentally responsible. They're very complex. I don't personally believe, and I'll talk about this a little more, that the main cause of poverty is personal irresponsibility. But a lot of people believe this. No disrespect to your former boss.
He doesn't believe that.
Well, we'll talk about that. I even have some quotes here. And the belief is that we can't really solve these problems, so the best we can do is have a little extra charity. That's number one. And number two is Americans have been conned into believing we never solve big problems, we can never solve big problems again. Therefore, we've got to try these small little pilot projects to deal with these issues. And I don't think...
Here we agree.
There we agree. And here, a slightly veiled reference to the mayor, and not just him, many other people basically say the war on poverty was an entire failure, or it didn't really solve anything, and therefore we can't solve problems by poverty by throwing money at it. Therefore, we have to start these pilot projects to test what works. And I basically make the argument that all those assumptions are wrong, and if you start with wrong assumptions, your solutions are going to be wrong. So if you start with the assumption that today is Wednesday and plan your rest of your week around that, the rest of your week's going to be wrong. So if you start an attack on poverty with the assumption that governments never worked, that big efforts don't work, that you can't solve poverty by throwing money at it, therefore we have to start small pilot projects, I suggest the rest of your week and the rest of your policies are going to be wrong. Between 1960 and 1973, the poverty rate in America was cut in half. It's cut in half. Now, I don't contend all of that is the Great Society. Say some of that is great post-war economic growth in America. But I contend a lot of that was fueled by government programs, foremost the GI Bill. GI Bill, you may know, people served in World War II, allowed people to pay for college, down payment on a first home, or starting a small business. My father was the first in his family to be able to go to college. Went to City College just a few blocks from here on the GI Bill, and I contend that was one of the reasons we had the greatest middle class in the world. Notice I said had. That's number one. Number two, the war on poverty, by and large, while it had lots of excesses, its main goal was to reduce poverty. Now, I said 1960 to 1973, starting with Kennedy before some of Johnson's programs, going into the Nixon years. So we can quibble over who was responsible for what, but if the rate was cut in half, 16 million Americans moved out of poverty into the middle class during that time. I would contend the flat-out contention that none of that worked is a little ridiculous. The VISTA program, which then was became later on part of the AmeriCorps program, was a great innovation. Head Start was a great innovation. Community action agencies were great innovations. And I also suggest that part of the reason elected officials can get away with saying things like you can't throw money at the problem is because it's poor people. People who believe that you can solve environmental problems by throwing money at them, who believe you can solve educational problems by throwing money at them, who believe you can improve the arts by throwing money at them, then say you can't fight poverty. The one problem defined in my mind, first and foremost, by lack of money. I say solving poverty without a lot more money is like solving drought without a lot more water. And that if a mayor came and said, you know what, I don't know what works in reducing crime. I really don't. Nothing's ever worked in the past. So I'm going to try some small pilot projects, a handful of neighborhoods. Oh, and by the way, by the time I'm done, there may actually be more crime than when I started. I would suggest that person would not be hailed as a great national champion. That person would be run out of town on a rail. And so I really think we have to examine these assumptions. Now, I'm not saying that government is the end-all and be-all solution to all these problems. I believe in individual responsibility deeply. I believe in the power of family and community. That being said, history will show that the times we made progress when the times we had federal leadership. And they're the only people that can print money. I actually show in my book we've collected poverty statistics only since 1960 in America. Every time successive Republican administrations have been in power in the White House, poverty has gone up. Every time successive Democratic administrations have been in the White House, poverty has gone down, with the exception of Jimmy Carter. He's the only president since we started counting where poverty went up, and there are macroeconomic issues and just competence issues, etc., as well-meaning as he is now. For you youngins, I laugh, when progressives, want to, honor Jimmy Carter. The left, or real liberals, when he was president, hated him. He supported, Ted Kennedy for president. In any case, I just urge you to examine, these assumptions. I have a whole chapter on welfare reform in my book, which is probably one of the most nuanced chapters in the book. I'm not necessarily noted for nuance, but I do have it here, and I basically said Clinton was right to sign the bill, but while he was president, it had mixed results, and the good economy, since then, it's had disastrous results. It's interesting, left-wing reviewers have twice said that I slammed Clinton on welfare reform, which I actually didn't. That being said, let's look at the reality. Only 10% of the poor people in America are now on welfare. And so we've done everything conservatives said we should do to reduce poverty. In big cities like New York, not every big city, but crime's gone down. Welfare is an infinitesimal part of what it once was. Teenage pregnancy rates have gone down, more poor people in the workforce, and yet more poor people are poorer. So we tried their way. It didn't work. Let's try another way. And let me talk a little more specifically about hunger. And one of the great finds in my book was a master's thesis from 1910 from another great Columbia grad, Frances Perkins. I hope you know the name. She was the first female cabinet secretary in American history. She was also the first New York State cabinet secretary for then Governor Al Smith, who was a great progressive leader before he went bitter and nuts and started opposing the New Deal. But that's a whole, another story. Anyway, she did these incredible things. She, helped write the Social Security Act. There's no bio out about her. I'm dying to read. She helped create minimum wage laws, but it turns out, little did she know, the most significant thing she would do was write a thesis for her graduate degree at Columbia in 1910 on hunger in New York City, among children in New York City. And I actually, you wrote to Columbia, sent them a small check, and they were supposed to send me a copy of the manuscript. And good old Columbia bureaucracy, they sent me microfilm. Who uses microfilm anymore. The Brooklyn Public Library was quite amused. I was the first person ever, I think, to come into their microfilm section with my own microfilm. And I printed out page by page, I think 25 cents a page. I think that cost me more than all my royalties from this book. Anyway, it's an incredible piece because it shows that hunger in New York City in 1910 was far worse than it is today. Hunger in New York City in 1910 was far worse than it was today. Now, sometimes advocates are loath to admit anything ever gets better because we think that'll hurt the urgency of our cause, people won't give us money, people won't march. I think that's wrong for two reasons. Number one, I think truth matters. Can I say that at a university? Truth matters? That if the right dumbs down the debate, I think the idea of some on the left, Michael Moore and others, that we should equally dumb down the debate, and if they make up facts, we make our own facts, I think that's just not morally correct. But just from a practical political strategy, if we give the impression things are always getting worse, why should people ever have hope? If they understand the converse, that things like the progressive movement, things like the war on poverty, weren't perfect but actually worked, helped improve things, then you could understand that progress matters. My example of cholera, you know that we get water from a long way away in New York sometimes. We have this amazing Croton Reservoir system led by government, led by public bonds. If you've been on either the Harlem River Drive or the Major Deegan, you see that great aqueduct over the Harlem River. That was an amazing engineering marvel at its time. You can go to the website of the New York City Department of Health, one of my favorite charts ever, death from pestilence in New York City. And it shows the yellow fever epidemics of the 1790s, then all these cholera epidemics I was talking about. Then it shows the year the Croton Reservoir was built. And it's cholera, Croton Reservoir built. It almost went away entirely. So when you understand this stuff works, you understand a little hope. So her thesis in 1910, she actually went into Hell's Kitchens before it was Clinton. The poor people there were Irish and Italian. People of color had basically not moved up to New York City yet at the time. Not to be stereotypical, but that's what she found. The Irish kids maybe had a little potatoes. The Irish kids maybe had a little. The Italian kids maybe had a little polenta, and that was basically it. They'd have coffee for 3 meals, maybe a piece of bread. Rarely meat, virtually never fresh vegetables, and virtually never, fresh milk. And if they did have milk, sometimes the kids would die from the putrid milk. And that was, what it was like to be a kid in 1910. Actually, since this builds as a reading, I'll read you one quick thing here from her thesis about one of the kids she examined. One of the children was an Italian boy with a continual pain in his chest and a bad cough which lasted 2 years. The father is a cobbler making $7 or $8 a week, and the family lives in the basement back rooms of the shop. The lad with the pain in his chest lives in a semi-dark, damp room and eats little besides macaroni, bread, and coffee. One further element of hopelessness is that he's now turned 14, has taken his working papers, and must get a factory job at once. Things are better for kids in New York City, even the most poor kids, by and large, in 1910. Even if their parents are the poorest and, either whatever reason aren't getting food stamps, the kids are almost definitely getting school lunch. Maybe some homeless kids aren't, but that's really at the margins. Most of the poorest kids are at least getting 5 good meals a day. Not enough kids are getting school breakfast, but some of the most desperately poor are. None of that existed in 1910. There was no food stamps program in 1910. There was no government help for feeding charities in 1910. There was no minimum wage in 1910. There were no child labor laws in 1910. In fact, I document twice the United States Supreme Court ruled that the U.S. Congress had no constitutional right to ban child labor. And that's how it was in 1910. Things are better. Now, Roosevelt instituting the New Deal, President Truman instituting the National School Lunch Program as a defense mechanism in the late 1940s because generals came to President Truman and said our boys are too malnourished to fight. Those things helped. And the growth I talked about, the post-war economic growth helped. So when we had it after the Industrial Revolution, third world style starvation like you still might see in the developing world today, that was dramatically reduced by all these developments in American society. But by the late 1960s, you could still see pockets of third world style starvation in America. You could see it a few blocks away from here in Harlem or Bed-Stuy. You could see it in white areas of Appalachia, in the hills of Tennessee or Kentucky or West Virginia. You could see it in Mexican-American areas of Texas or the Texas-Mexico border. You could see it in Native American reservations around the country, and you could see it in some of the traditionally rural African American parts of the Mississippi Delta. We know this because doctors went down there and documented this. And one of the most incredible things I also found in my book, in addition to the Francis Perkins research, is I found a doctor who had done all this research. Dr. Raymond Wheeler was from the University of North Carolina, and I'm looking at his archives online, and it all is its, research notes check, testimony check, blah, 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 all the normal boring research stuff, and then it says hate mail. Hate mail? Who would write hate mail to a pediatrician working on hunger issues? And I postulated it was 1968. A lot of it was racist, so I wrote to the University of North Carolina, sent them a little check. They sent me a big box of correspondence. And letter after letter was hate mail from whites in the South saying he was a traitor to his race for having the temerity to say that African American kids were hungry. And I actually reprinted 2 of the letters in full in the book, as vile as they are. Actually, in my original draft, which was like 800 pages, I had like 10 of them, and my editor said, enough already. You want someone to read this, right? But I have them there so people see what they're up against. And I contend that throughout American history, one of the main reasons we haven't had as a robust safety net as, let's say, Western or Northern Europe is racism. That Americans believe that people getting help, people are poor, people are hungry, or the others are non-white, when in fact, throughout the majority of American history, they've been white. Now, true, people of color have been disproportionately poor, but the majority of people poor on welfare and food stamps have always been white. But that's not what people believe. And still to this day, I did a press conference with a city council person a few months ago calling on Costco to start accepting food stamps benefits. They don't. And it's ridiculous because they're hurting their own bottom line. And I had a blog on the New York Times, and people wrote in, even in this great liberal modern New York, and all these people were defending Costco for not accepting food stamps. Now, they didn't use the N-word, but they used a lot of code words. These people and those people. In my mind, most times when that's used, those are code words. And they said, we're glad Costco doesn't accept food stamps. We're glad because these people are dirty, they're smelly, they're crooked, they defecate in stores. Now, I've been in New York most of my whole life, the suburbs, if you include that. I've never once been even among very low-income people where I saw someone defecate in front of me. But apparently this opponent of food stamps saw that. It's preposterous. Just yesterday I was on WNYC talking about food stamps, and someone blogged in that they should have separate lines for food stamps recipients because they don't want to have to wait behind someone who is wasting our tax dollars. So I suggest these attitudes persist. And as you know, I think some of you have taken comparative politics, that Northern Europe's actually moving away from their cradle-to-grave safety. And I suggest one of the reasons they're doing so is those countries are becoming more diverse, and so it's less them helping people like them. Anyway, despite all this virulent reaction against these reports, they had a very profound effect. They fueled the poor people's movements of Dr. King. I always learned, sort of growing up, that Dr. King's poor people's movement sort of petered out after he was assassinated. And I found in my research that's not quite precisely true. Their main demand was the creation of a more robust federal nutrition assistance safety net, number one. Number two, CBS had a documentary in 1968, primetime TV, 50 minutes in prime time, that really highlighted these issues. And those two things combined had a profound effect. I have a chapter in my book called Richard Nixon, Despot, Crook, Thief, and one of history's greatest hunger fighters. And I actually document how he was pushed from ignoring hunger as an issue, denying it was an issue, to within a year having the first and to this day only White House conference on hunger. And he did it because there was political pressure. As a result of that, as a result of a bipartisan coalition in Congress, Bob Dole, a right-wing Republican from Kansas, George McGovern, a liberal Democrat from South Dakota, teamed up and created the Federal Nutrition Assistance Safety Net as we know it today. And guess what? It worked. By the late 1970s, within a decade of it being implemented, widespread hunger in America was all but wiped out. The doctors went back to the same parts of the country and found it was gone. Both economic growth, higher wages back then, if you were working full-time, poor people in America in the late 70s, but basically it's because they weren't working or they weren't working enough hours. If they were working full-time, they may still have been marginally poor, but they weren't hungry, I would claim. And we didn't need soup kitchens and food pantries. We needed some soup kitchens that served the traditionally destitute. They were basically on the Boweries or Skid Row before they were hipster central. But this whole idea of boxed and canned food being given out as groceries to families basically didn't exist in New York or America before the Reagan era. In New York City, there are 28 feeding agencies when the Hunger Hotline was started in 1978. Today, there are 1,200. 2/3 of which are food pantries serving boxed and canned food to families. And if I start with one secular parable of the yellow fever, I'll come close to, and cholera, I'll come close to closing out with one more that I lay out in my book, and that's of the bucket brigades. We used to fight fires one bucket at a time. They made us feel great. You know, de Tocqueville said, you know, volunteer fire departments is sort of the spirit of what made America different than that old festering Europe. We had volunteers do things. You know, and today you can say these were great. You didn't need a big government bureaucracy. You didn't need a lot of forms. They were the faith-based armies of compassion of their time, right? The only problem with the bucket brigades is they didn't work. City after city burnt to a crisp. And today we don't have cities burning down because we replaced volunteers with professional fire departments that are paid to be there at 3 a.m. in February when the bucket brigades weren't. I calculated one morning at 4 a.m., this is what I do to make your learning great. I woke up one morning at 4 a.m. to calculate how much water a bucket brigade could deliver. And I calculated it was 60 gallons of water a minute. Pretty good. A modern fire truck delivers 1,000 gallons of water a minute. And so, which would you prefer if your house is burning down? A bucket brigade that may or may not show up, that has 60 gallons of water, that can't reach your second or third floor where you are with your cat, or a professional fire department that's paid to be on call? I suggest it's that. And yet when it comes to hunger and poor people, we've given the nation the impression unpaid, uncoordinated volunteers can somehow solve this major social problem. Giving the impression that canned food drives can solve hunger in America is like giving the impression we can fill the Grand Canyon with a teaspoon. It cannot and will not work. For decades, we've been feeding more and more people through charities. As of 2005, 25 million people. In New York City, 1.3 million in just the city getting food from charities, and yet more people are going hungry. 36.2 million Americans live in households that can't afford enough food, according to the Department of Agriculture. That's a population bigger than the state of California. Giving the impression we can solve that problem with just more charity is just not true. Now, I run a nonprofit group. I love nonprofit groups. We work and support them. We want to have them to get the support they need to fill in the gaps, but they cannot be the first line of defense against a major social problem. Now, I did this op-ed in the Washington Post 2 weeks ago defending Obama's tax proposal to marginally reduce what only 1% of the very wealthiest Americans to deduct on their taxes, and using that money to pay for things like universal health care and food stamps. I have never got a more violent reaction to anything I've written in a few decades of doing this. The right went berserk that I would suggest that government could be more efficient than nonprofit groups. But in my book, I actually document that the food stamps program has about 15% overhead. When you include from the food movement to wherever it is, in Illinois or Michigan to here to a food bank and then to a feeding charity, many feeding charities have 25 or 35% overhead overall, the whole stream of food distribution. And honestly, what a lot of the groups tell you about how they distribute the food, you give us $1, we'll give you 50 meals, you've seen all that. A lot of that's just really bogus. I don't want to. I'm on TV here. So. I love these folks; they're my friends. But the truth is, government paid for a lot of that food, and they're only including moving it from their warehouse to a feeding agency, a soup kitchen, or a food pantry. So, a more accurate description: give us $1, and because your tax dollars have already bought much of this food, we're going to move it a bit closer to where it's going to be served. But when charities give the impression they're so much more efficient than government, no wonder people wouldn't support government. So, look, we don't have kids starving in the streets anymore. What do we have? We have people choosing between food and rent. People choosing between food and health care. We have parents going without food themselves so they can feed their kids. We have 80% of the school children in America and New York City eligible for school breakfast don't get it. We have people eating crumbs off of someone else's plates at a Starbucks when they're gone, and a school official in New York told me they saw a kid going through a dumpster to get their breakfast. This is in a city that, as of last year, had 64 billionaires. And their combined worth equaled 64 times the net worth, the annual earnings of all 1.7 million people in poverty. I used to make fun of, the top earning New York, not make fun of, compare the top earning New Yorker, Mr. Koch, to all 1.7 million people in poverty, and said his net worth was 5 times the combined annual earnings of all 1.7 million people in poverty. But now, according to Forbes, that richest person is the mayor, so I'll have to do that. And I am a committed capitalist. My grandparents came here and built a better life for us through their hard work and determination, but I suggest we've lost that opportunity, capitalism. So, all those problems of food insecurity, and by the way, we can talk about this in the question and answer period, is that there is no question that hunger and food insecurity are contributing factors to obesity. Because if you're in a neighborhood that doesn't have fresh produce, and there's something I support the mayor on, bringing more fresh produce into low-income neighborhoods. If you're in a neighborhood, most low-income neighborhoods, you can't afford the healthiest food, you're going to buy the cheaper, more filling, more fattening food. All these problems cost our society $90 billion a year. because hungry, according to a study from Harvard, a not very significant institution that we don't really accept much here, but occasionally they do okay work. According to them, a study from the Harvard School of Public Health, hunger costs our society $90 billion a year in lost wages because hungry workers work less productively, hungry students study less well, and hungry and malnourished Americans cost our healthcare system tens of billions of dollars a year in healthcare spending. I calculated in my book, as of 2 years ago, we could have ended hunger and food insecurity entirely in America for $24 billion in extra food purchasing power for low-income Americans, either increased wages or increased safety net or some combination of the two. Now, if a handy person comes to you and says, we can fix the hole in your roof, which is costing you $90 a year in extra utilities, and we can fix it for $24. Assuming you have that $24, haven't spent your last $24 on all you can eat, how hungry is America, you would spend it, wouldn't you? And so that's what we should do. I can go into my plan in more detail, but basically I say we have to return to a time of living wage jobs and government promoting living wage jobs. 2, we have to return to a robust safety net, and not just for food, but for housing and health care. And actually, I call for a fairly radical centrist idea of combining all the more than 12 federal nutrition assistance safety net programs into one program and having one application. Meeting the conservative objective of reducing bureaucracy, meeting the progressive theoretical objective of giving more money to poor people to spend the way they need it. Support a robust child nutrition safety net. One of the things the mayor's done that I think is great is a pilot project to serve breakfast in first period classrooms. Because when the kids have to go to a lunchroom, they're not going to go because it's humiliating, it's stigma. And lastly, talk about community food security in context. I talk about community gardens and farmers markets and community support in agriculture, but I really take the foodies to task. People like Alice Waters who say poor people are irresponsible if they don't cook everything from scratch. She was asked, the celebrity chef, what poor people should do if they can't afford enough nutritious food, and she said, buy one less pair of Nikes. That has very serious implications, what she said. So I support more, community gardens and farmers markets, but to the people who say this is going to replace a safety net, replace living wage jobs, poppycock. Even in parts of the country that have 12-month growing seasons, which New York City does not, you cannot have these in replacement. They need to be additive. And last, we need a serious war on poverty. I'll close with this thought. Things that used to be seen in America as unthinkable, things which were once thought to be inevitable are now unthinkable, right? We had slavery even in our beloved New York. We had child labor. You know what breaker boys were? They were little boys 6 to 8, 9 years old. They worked in anthracite coal mines. Their job was to cut up the coal by hand, to break up the coal by hand. They'd lose fingers, they'd lose arms, they'd get black lung, they'd die in their teens, and they were paid pennies a month. And the working assumption in America at the time is this is just how it is. Of course poor kids are going to work. Now, there's still a little child labor in America at the edges, but it's illegal, it's prosecutable, and it's basically not commonplace in America. What was once thought to be inevitable is now unthinkable. I believe that if we almost ended hunger in the 1970s with the right public policies, we can end hunger in America today. President Obama's actually pledged to end child hunger in America by 2015. I doubt you know that because it's not been in the media. It's not nearly as significant as what dog he has. But he has done that. So I think he'd be the first to say it's our job to get him to do it. It's our job to get Congress to pony up the money. It's our job to get corporate executives to take some personal responsibility. I think maybe they should own 5 vacation homes. But do they really need 7 vacation homes and pay their workers so little that they can't feed their families? That's not how corporate executives acted 5 decades ago. And it wasn't because of a law, it was because of a personal feeling of responsibility. So I think we can end hunger in America, and I hope you, in addition to volunteering at pantries and kitchens, which is nice and helpful, but do the really important work of engaging in the public policy work necessary so we have a sane society again, so we don't have people having to go beg for their food. That's my opening rant. I've been in the Midwest on my book tour, so I've slowed down. Usually I talk a little faster to be, at New York speed.
We have some questions. Get started. I guess that means I have to start. Okay. Let's talk about...
I said nice things about the mayor, too.
You were amazing, always. Let's talk about New York City a little bit. And I was very intrigued by the point you made that doing sort of boutique, small pilot programs is not really the solution to this kind of a problem. What do you have on the table specifically for the hunger initiative that you think should be engaged by the city, especially through the Department of Human Resources Administration, which is the city's main welfare agency, which has been virtually absent from most of the new initiatives that are coming out by the city?
It was odd. The main poverty agency was not even in the lead. They were sort of an afterthought to the poverty initiative. But you know this, but you guys don't. I have grave reservations about the way the city manages the food stamps program. It's now been renamed the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, with a theory from Congress that will reduce the stigma. I'm not so sure. Now, food stamps have dramatically increased in New York City. Let me be clear, there's still 150,000 fewer people receiving food stamps in New York City than the height of food stamps participation in 1995. Now, I want to say one thing about the mayor who says it's numbers, numbers, numbers. I actually think that's garbage. I think he goes with the numbers when they're in his favor. When it doesn't go in his favor, he totally ignores them. So look at social services. When he wants to prove that welfare is really, really, really down, he says, oh, they're lower than any time since the 60s. Because even liberals agree anyone on welfare is bad. Now, that's a whole side issue. I say judging the success of welfare reform solely by how many people have been removed from the rolls is like judging the success of a hospital solely by how many people left it, without differentiating between who left it sick, dead, or cured. Now, again, I have a nuanced view on welfare reform we can talk about. That being said, when it comes to welfare reform, he goes back to the 60s. When he goes to food stamps, he only goes to the day he took office. And so Giuliani kicked like 700, 800,000 people off the food stamps program, often illegally, and that's just not my opinion. A federal judge ruled he was doing it illegally. So then Bloomberg comes and restores, 500,000 people and says, look what a hero I am. And so it's like the guy before you cut down 10 trees, you replanted 7 and say, look at a beautiful forest. Now keep in mind, in 1995, when food stamps were at its peak, I wasn't here at the time and wasn't involved here. I was at USDA. Even then, there were many, many people, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people eligible for it that weren't getting it. So the city disputes when I say today there could be 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 people eligible for food stamps but not getting it. But even look where they were. It's hard to imagine that the people eligible for it then, not eligible now. There have been slight changes in what legal immigrants are eligible for. And by the way, these are raw numbers, and the population of New York City is bigger than that. So why is this the case? And by the way, nationwide, I won't go into a long dissertation on this, but in the late 1990s, due to both welfare reform and an improving economy, food stamps participation around the country plummeted. Now, some of that was good, because some of it was the system working as it's supposed to, people moving into jobs and their income was higher. Good. Some of it was people illegally being removed from the rolls. Everywhere else in the country, people wised up and said, wait a second, we hate welfare, but we should like food stamps, because food stamps are work support. They're not welfare. Even Governor Pataki, a conservative Republican, people say he's a liberal Republican. That's a whole other issue. Our definition of liberal versus conservative is now how you stand on the environment, gay rights, and abortion, when it used to be how you stood on, economic issues. And I think that's not anymore. I think by a definition of 40 years ago, Pataki's a right-winger, but just because occasionally he wouldn't lock up a gay person, we say he's liberal. Anyway, point is that even he understood that food stamps weren't welfare. George W. Bush understood that food stamps weren't welfare. They said they were work support, that even as we're reducing the welfare rolls, we should increase food stamps, right? One person of prominence in America, other than the Heritage Foundation, didn't take that position. That was Rudy Giuliani. And his successor, I must say, has been ambivalent about that. I don't know what he said in private, but to me, what I hear him say in public, some days he says, yeah, people should get food stamps, and his staff sort of twisting them to sort of say that. And other days, what comes out of his mouth, it sounds awfully like he thinks food stamps are welfare. And so 2 of the most egregious policies of the Giuliani era regarding food stamps, in my mind, this mayor has actually maintained. One is insisting that people get fingerprinted or electronically fingerprinted to get food stamps. And not only does it treat you like criminals, 46 states in the union don't have it. They have lower fraud rates than New York. Governor Spitzer tried eliminating it for the state. He eliminated it in the rest of the state. The mayor objected and kept it in New York City. We got rid of it in Buffalo, but somehow our mayor is taking the position his constituents are uniquely criminal. And I can go into more depth. It doesn't reduce fraud. It costs money. The only people making money off this are the contractors who hold, the contract to do it. So that's number one. And beyond the stigma, we've gone through all this effort to remove the need of people to do office visits for food stamps. So you're supposed to be able to apply online. We got, with the city, $1 million for a pilot project from USDA to allow people to apply online. This was great. And we went for years with people in that being exempt from finger imaging. Someone found out about it and then insisted even in our pilot project people get finger imaged. So people who ordinarily would never have to go to a city office, could do the interview by phone, now have to go to a city office to provide their finger image. And by the way, an adult can apply on behalf of the whole household for food stamps, but when you're finger imaged, every adult in the household has to physically go. So if you have a mother, you have a father, you have a 19-year-old in the household working, they all have to go. So that's one thing. Eliminate that. Two is a whole broader issue of work requirements for able-bodied adults without dependents. Most of us believe that if you're working or trying to find work, if you can't find work, particularly in a bad economy, you'd still get food stamps while you're looking for work. I believe the mayor's been misinformed and continues to say things that I believe are not factually accurate, that if he takes this waiver, he's going to, let people not look for work. It's just not true. But the stimulus package had a further language in it to say that we don't have this requirement anymore, and the mayor insisted that, we're placing everyone in these workfare jobs, so we still do. So that's my long answer, that food stamps are just the big ticket item. It dwarfs everything else. The average food stamps benefit in New York City is $240 per family per month. That was before the stimulus package. Now it's going to be like $270 per family per month. Juliette, you've worked at a pantry. How much is the average food bag you give out? How much worth of food for a month, you think?
Oh, it's not maybe for like 3 days.
Right, so many of these pantries give out $20 or $30 food. So beyond my philosophical objection to replacing government with charities is very concrete. We've replaced a guarantee of $250 worth of food with the possibility of $30 worth of charity food. The government food you get to buy at a store depending on what you think your family needs. The charity need, you get what everyone else. So fixed food stamps, number one. As I talked about, universal school meals, which I think we're moving towards there. And I just had a brief meeting, I accosted him in the hallway, as I often do, with Chancellor Klein yesterday at this event we were both at and talked to him about expanding school breakfast. We can do that. And other things we would agree on, like expanding after-school snacks and summer meals paid for by the federal government. So that could go a long way of doing it. But the other part of the mayor's initiative, I give him a lot of credit for saying, even though the state has a responsibility, the federal government has a responsibility, I as mayor, I'm going to try my best to reduce poverty. But I just think no mayor without the proper economic environment and national policy environment can dramatically reduce poverty when the other environment's so great. Now, I can get another argument. I would claim this mayor helped re-elect George W. Bush, and that's a whole other issue when he was a Republican before he was an independent, before he was a Republican again. That being said, I give him credit for trying to do stuff on the city level, but as long as we have poverty skyrocketing around the country, hunger skyrocketing around the country, these are national problems. People do have, mobility, that you can make some, progress on the state level, but without that other leadership at these other levels, it's going to be really hard to have a whole lot of progress.
Question. Is the government doing anything less because of nonprofits and NGOs? And what do you think is the impact that nonprofits can have by doing anything different?
So two excellent questions. I have a whole chapter in my book on charity. The second book, best book on hunger in the last few decades, is called Sweet Charity. If you ever met Janet Papadike, she's a professor of sociology at Hunter, and she basically says the pantries and kitchens, as well-meaning as they are, have actually increased hunger in America. And she makes the argument that they create a moral safety valve that essentially lets government off the hook, that if they didn't exist, it's sort of the Marxist argument, honestly, that poor people would sort of rise up and demand social change. I agree with some of her arguments, but I actually reject that, because I think that given our current political system, look, if poor people didn't, have a revolution in the 1930s, they're not going to have one now. And I think that just based on American political history, that if these programs went away, the most immediate outcome would not be more social justice, would be more starvation, more suffering. So I'm a revolutionary with this grand vision. I'm also very practical, that people can't eat my book. They can't eat social change. They can't eat these great, blueprints. So they need food today. And so I actually don't think they should go away. I do think, though, they should change what they're doing a bit. They should not give the false impression they're solving the problem. They should not give the false impression they're better than government. And they can do more good things. They can be centers for food stamps outreach, as we're doing in some of these pilot, projects. The bank robber, Willie Sutton, said, "Why do you rob banks?" He said, that's where the money is. Why do you go to pantries and kitchens? That's where poor, hungry people are. They can be centers of nutrition outreach. They can be centers of financial empowerment and job training. They can do community gardens. But as long as nonprofits are just treading water, providing basic food, this more sophisticated stuff they're never going to be able to do, or rarely be able to do. So I suggest that we go back to a balance where government does what it does best. And I say provide safety nets, create economic opportunity, because I do believe, all my rants against rich people aside, the single best way to reduce poverty is economic growth with fair wages. Go back to government promoting that in a balanced way that really focuses on not just rich people getting economic growth, but everyone getting economic growth, and providing a safety net. My late mother, who just passed away a few months ago, was on the Social Security program for decades, never got her check late a day. Food stamps is another issue. You got to recertify, etc. But other government programs, once you're in, you're in. And so government's really great at grinding out McBenefits. So if government does what it does best and help provide a better sort of basic safety net, the nonprofits could be freed up to do what we theoretically do best: innovation, specialization, meeting immediate needs, being very responsive. But I think we've really lost that balance. And when I did that Washington Post op-ed, all these people say, well, taxes should be voluntary. We shouldn't have to pay for these poor people. We should all do it voluntarily. And I said, should I be able to choose not to pay my taxes if I don't think you should have a police force in your town? And they said, that's different. Or put it another way, if there's a big snowstorm, which would you prefer? A big plow coming through of sanitation workers who would just say everyone in your dorm should figure out who's going to take a shovel, and clean up the West Highway. But only when it comes to poor people do we think charities can do it. So I'm pro-charity, I run one. But let me talk one more thing philosophically about legitimacy. And this really drives the right crazy. Government is more legitimate than nonprofit groups. Government is more legitimate than nonprofit groups. That drives them nuts when I say that. I have a fine, upstanding board of directors of 9 people. They pick me. No one elected them. Whatever I may or may not think of certain of our elected officials, they were elected. Well, not our governor, not our junior senator, but most. Eventually they will be elected. They were picked by the American people. And if they're not representing our views, it's our job to work to get them to represent their views. So I actually believe government's a lot more legitimate than a nonprofit group. It totally drives the right berserk when I say that, but I believe... And one last thing. When I was in government, everyone thought I was a dog, and now I'm in the nonprofit sector, they think I'm a saint. When I meet people, you work for a nonprofit group, they're embarrassed at these rich cocktail parties. I wasn't a saint when I was in government. I'd like to think I'm not a dog now. 90% of what I did on a daily basis is very similar. It's just our bias against government, that it's automatically bad and automatically evil, and nonprofits are automatically saintly. And people said, when you leave government and get a real job in the nonprofit sector, then you'll understand government isn't the end-all and be-all. Now that I've been in the nonprofit sector this June, just as long as I was in government, I actually believe more strongly in the role of government. Because all the turf, all the bureaucracy, all the pettiness, all the waste, all the ego that on a rare occasion is in government is in the nonprofit sector. None of my peer organization, no, 100.
No.
Why have you come to the conclusion that, or perhaps I misunderstood, that the right solution from the government would be a living wage, or promoting a living wage, as opposed to more food-specific, more expanding food stamp programs specifically, or other sort of...
Well, I think the best long-term is wages, because one of the things I talk about in the book is I sort of I have a chart making fun of the left and the right when it comes to poverty, because I basically say, the right punishes poor people and the left patronizes poor people. And when it came to welfare reform, both were missing the boat because most thought that poor people didn't want to work. The right had their racist assumptions, why poor people didn't want to work, or really patronizing assumptions. And the left basically took the position, well, poor people are so oppressed, they couldn't possibly work. Jason DeParle has a great book on welfare reform where he basically shows before welfare reform, a lot of people on welfare were working. They were just working off the books. And the biggest shift is whether people went from off the books, not on the books, not whether they started working or not. So I actually believe it's human nature, from rats wanting to like turn their thing to get their food to human beings, that people like feeling that they're supporting society. And that's one of the things I think the left missed about what Clinton got with welfare reform, because he spent far more time with poor people and frankly non-white people than the vast majority of liberals, that he understood that there was a dignity of work. So I really think more than anything, if I had a society that everyone who could work worked and they earned enough to feed their family, that would be the best. That being, because as much as I'll say to I'm blue in the face, food stamps aren't welfare, 60% of America will never believe it. and then poor people will get the feeling, everyone else hates me because I'm getting this. It's so funny with the economic downturn. I have some pretty right-wing friends. One who's, they get all these government benefits and then they want to know why people are raising their taxes. And that is my benefit. And so given that wages are a harder thing, economic growth is a harder thing, and there's, government can do a lot to affect that, but it's not 100% under its control. I certainly say the fastest way to end hunger entirely is to expand the federal nutrition assistance safety net. So I don't want to say we shouldn't do that. We should do that immediately at the same time we're working towards broader wages. Look, as I said, we can end hunger in America for 2 years ago it said $24 billion. So just make up a number now, it's $30 billion because of the, the recession. And we could end hunger for that year. But unless we reduce poverty, we're still going to have to spend that $30 billion every year just to keep people even. And if things get worse and food costs go up, it'll be more than $30 billion. So that's my long answer. I will fight to the death for improved safety net. But my long-term answer is living wage. Now, part of what frustrates me about the American political system, if you were just to read the paper or to hear a city council hearing and hear me testify, you'd never really know that my top answer is wages. I think the mayor would probably be shocked to hear me saying that I probably agree with them that the best answer is wages, because the system is so polarizing. We don't have a debate over wages. We have hearings on do you support more food stamps or less food stamps. And if I have a choice between more food stamps or less food stamps, I'm always going to be for more food stamps. And that's one of the reasons I wrote a book, to try to see if I could get a little nuance in there.
I was wondering, economically, how does this all work out if you increase these safety nets and then increase living wage? Wouldn't that also increase the prices of food? And where does the balance?
Well, I don't think it would. And I would say, we now have, 80 years of experience with minimum wage, legislation, and, the right throughout that time has said every time you raise the minimum wage, you're going to, kill jobs. Last time the minimum wage was raised in America, millions of people got raises, and I've yet to meet one person who's lost, a job. Clinton tells a story in his memoirs. He goes up to a worker and he says, people say you're going to lose your job if we raise your wages, and the worker says, I'll take my chances. Inflation is a slightly different issue, and it's interesting. The only thing poor people really had going for them in America versus the rest of the world, really, particularly the rest of the developed world, until recently, was that food prices were lower here than virtually any place else on the planet, particularly any developed country. The last few years, food prices have soared, and there are a lot of reasons behind that. So the one and only advantage poor people had here vis-a-vis the rest of the world, they've lost. So I do think there could conceivably be some inflation, but I worry about that a lot less. I don't think economic history bears out that doing those things. I mean, want to talk about federal aid increasing inflation? Talking about college cost office. There's a new study out about the dramatic increase in administrative costs at universities around America. Food's actually risen many years less than the rate of inflation. Your tuition has raised a lot faster than that. I warn you guys.
Yeah, go ahead.
One question.
Yeah.
What do you see the role of microfinance in this context?
Microfinance and sort of the related area of assets development, I'm a strong supporter of. And I like the fact that the mayor was promoting it here in New York City. But this is another example of where it's really hard to get nuance across. When I was a young policy analyst for a think tank in Washington, my first job, real policy job out of college in 1989, I edited one of the first paper on this whole idea of assets development. And I talk about in the book the importance of, if you really want to break poverty policy and move beyond the left stale left-right debate where the left says spend more on welfare, the right spends less, and really empower low-income people to move out of poverty, the long-term answer is helping them enter the economic mainstream. The way I put it, move from owing to owning. And boy, just as I became an adult and got my first job that paid anything, actually, when I entered the federal government, I increased my salary fourfold from my campaign work. Literally overnight, I started paying more in taxes than I never earned before. And I had huge credit card debts, which kept piling up. And then all of a sudden, I was able to pay them back and start getting this thing called interest. This is pretty good. And then a friend took me and said, you should really buy a place. There's this thing called the mortgage interest deduction. That's a really good deal. And I bought a place in Washington. When I left Washington, I was able to, take a big salary cut coming here and dramatically increase my, mortgage costs just because I was able to sell a place in Washington. So I think key is entering the economic mainstream, moving from owing to owing. And I say that helping people earn, save, and work their way out of poverty. That being said, there's nuance in this. And if you give the impression people aren't doing that because they're irresponsible or just don't know how, as sometimes I think people give the impression, then I have a problem with that they sort of have to be bribed to good behavior as opposed to enabled to good behavior. Now, there's a thin line between those two things, and sometimes it's an arbitrary line. That's number one. Number two, you cannot do that in a vacuum from the rest of economic policy. So sure, financial education is fine and important, but if you're earning $20,000 a year and paying $18,000 a year in rent, the problem isn't that you don't know how to save money. The problem is you're paying too much in rent and getting too less in wages. So that's another criticism of the mayor's, poverty initiative. It really does, in my impression, seem like he's saying if people are just educated enough, if they're more responsible, they do that. So I support assets development. I support microfinance. Idea of starting a small business, particularly my business. A lot of food is one of the best places for microfinance. It's one of the places immigrants can bring some of their cultural teachings to this. I just saw a movie. Any of you seen Chop Shop? It's a great movie by a guy who just did a better-known picture, Goodbye Solo. It's about a kid. I talked to him that child labor's gone, but it's about a kid in Willets Point in Queens working in an illegal auto shop, and he's saving money to buy like a taqueria, moving truck. So that's the American dream, right? It's the stand and the truck, then you have the chain of taco places, and in 50 years, tacos are as American as pizza. So that's the American dream. But again, if you're not earning enough to feed your family, this idea you're going to put all this money down on savings. I also have this crazy idea that I've never really talked about, is finding a way to help people who do the lottery save. And setting up separate savings accounts for like individual development accounts to save money. If you do like a government-sponsored lottery, like for every buck you put in the lottery, you put $3 in savings, you get an extra lottery point. And maybe we can unite with the right. That's one thing I agree with the religious right on, opposing gambling. They oppose it on moral values. I oppose it because it's a grand rip-off of government for poor people. Anyway, that's a long answer. So I support microfinance. Even got someone Kiva. It's a great place where online you can buy someone to do a small business overseas. It's a great gift. I worn you out.
No,
exhausted our room.
I have another question.
Okay.
This is it is a kind of policy question about how the issue of food stamps is used politically in the debate over hunger policy. So one of the things that always distressed me and confused me in some ways was how I saw within the advocacy community that the number of people receiving food stamps was used, and we talked about this, remember, in your paper. The number of people, I thought you would bring it up, but now I'm going to have to.
We're going to talk to them about it.
Okay, the number of people who've used food stamps is used as a statistic by advocates to show that government policy is failing, that they're still poor, that people are still poor. So if you are in government, let's say, and trying to evaluate what you should do next as a policy, if the advocacy community takes the increase of the number of people using food stamps as an indicator that poverty is going up, then aren't you creating a disincentive for anybody in government to want to increase the number of people on food stamps? I mean, it's the same you know, we want to increase the number of people on food stamps if they're eligible so that they can get food. From a basic point of view, it makes sense. But at the same time, I find myself there's a political conundrum here because it's used then to bash over elected officials over the head and say, hey, the number of people on food stamps is going up, therefore poverty is going up, and you know your policies are failing.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that, and I rarely said that, and occasionally I was standing next to other people who said it, and sometimes when you get an invitation from allies, you sort of can't refuse, so to speak. That being said, it's interesting from the other side. You know, my first job at the Department of Agriculture was actually not a policy job. It's another story I can tell some of you over beers. My first job at the Department of Agriculture was press secretary and communications director for the department. I was 28 and had 156 people working for me, about 154 of whom were older than me. I'd never been on a farm, and I was press secretary for the Secretary of Agriculture. And Bill Clinton was trying to pass a stimulus bill. Through Congress because there was a recession then, and I found out that food stamps had gone up. And I actually wanted to issue a press release saying, "Hey, food stamps have gone up. This proves that Clinton needs a stimulus, package." And career civil servants there got furious. Well, we don't want to politicize the press. Now, some of those are Republicans who had spent the last 12 years politicizing the heck out of the communications function there. So I agreed with them it was going to be a statement on behalf from the Secretary of Agriculture saying this. But as an advocate, you know, there are a lot of proxies for talking about how hunger is increasing. We talked about the number of people going to pantries and kitchens, and some people in the city heatedly debated whether more people going to pantries and kitchens mean more people are in need. I heatedly debated back and said, you know, these places often have hours worth of lines. You know, you're not going unless you really need it. Then there's, you know, the USDA comes out with numbers every year on how many people are food insecure. That comes from census data. It's a little harder, I find, for the government to dispute that, although occasionally they do when they don't like the numbers. And then the number of people on food stamps. Now, since I'm always yelling, you know, that there aren't enough people on food stamps, that, you know, I've tried not to do that, but occasionally someone calls me up and they want to do a press conference and they're an ally of ours and they've been supportive of other things, I'll stand next to them and say, yeah, you know, food stamps are going up. But I agree with you. It does send a mixed message. The other thing is I have a very difficult personal time with it. I'm often out there saying, boy, food stamps are hard to get. Food stamps are hard to get. The city stinks for making them so hard to get. And on my other hand, I'm doing press conferences, hey, you low-income people, you should really apply for food stamps. And so, you know, that I feel bad about, because on one hand, this other goal of trying to change the policy, I do worry overnight whether I'm, you know, unintentionally discouraging people from applying. And so, you know, we in our press conference, we don't always sound like we worry about these things, but some of us actually do.
Any more questions here?
Sorry. Have you studied other countries as well?
Not really, and maybe that's a second book. I do actually open my book with a slight story of I was actually on vacation in Mali, West Africa. I went on a music tour there. If you ever get a chance to go there, it's got one of the most amazing musical cultures on the planet, just one of the most amazing cultures on the planet, but it's also one of the poorest places, you know, in the world. And there's no question whatsoever that the poorest Americans here, with the exception of some homeless people, generally among the poorest Americans here, they moved with the same lifestyle there. They'd be upper middle class. No question about that. It's all relative. So a guy accosted me on the street, and I thought he was, you know, wanting to sell me something or ask for money or something, and all he wanted to do was walk with me and talk to me about America. And he was convinced we had like streets paved with gold, we had Shaquille O'Neal and you know, and Bill Gates, and if he could only get to America, things would be great. And I sort of walked through, you know, Mali's one of the few places on the planet. It's still mostly a subsistence economy, particularly a little outside of the city. So they said, what do you do if you need heat? Well, I cut down a tree. You know, well, got to pay Con Ed here. You know, what do you do? You need a place to sleep. You know, I find a place. If no one objects, I stay there and sort of walk through. And so, while obviously a heck of a lot more people there are horribly malnourished than here, living a subsistence economy is a little different even living here. Now, the only real comparison I have in the book that's quasi-legit or legit social science is a comparison with Canada. And I say it's a good comparison because they're the only country that actually used the USDA food insecurity methodology and adapted it to Canada. And not only did we find there's less hunger per capita in Canada, and some people would say, well, there's just less poverty. The most startling statistic to me is that there's far less hunger among equally poor people in Canada than there is here. And now, I would suggest part of that is health care. I know it's horrible and they're evil up there for having temerity to provide people health care. If you could solve affordable housing and health care in America, you'd solve 60% of hunger. You know, our healthcare crisis in America directly contributes to hunger in two ways. People come, pantries and kitchens, are often really sick, mentally and physically sick, and it's untreated because they can't afford it, number one. And number two, people go to pantries and kitchens because they have they spent their money on healthcare or prescriptions and they can't spend it on food. So, you know, Canada is about the best example, but I'd say anecdotally, you know, just from my travels and my limited reading, you know, Western Europe, you know, other industrialized nations, we certainly have comparisons on poverty in various ways, and I think it's fair to say that virtually every major Western industrialized nation in the world has far less poverty, and particularly far less child poverty, you know, than the United States, and I think it's fair to extrapolate out of that they have a lot less hunger. Although they're taking our wrong lessons, they're starting to go to the bucket brigades. You know, I'm not saying there's perfect, and I'm not saying in Sweden if you get really big welfare, there wasn't some person who'd be lazy and get that, and I'm not saying there's no legitimacy to that critique, but I think they viewed this great America, free market, everything, and they're starting to have food pantries and soup kitchens in Western Europe, which 30 years ago they never had. And it's fascinating, the European press loves coming here and interviewing me. I get far more play in the European press than the American press, because it fills in, especially pre-Obama, their idea that we're all racist, horrible, you know, jackals, and this is like the Western frontier. And I'm always half as critical to the foreign press as I am to ours. It's like a Jew, I can be critical of Israel, but don't dare you. And so I can be critical of America, you know, don't dare you come here and you're smug after you just beat the heck out of your immigrants, tell me America stinks.
Wow. Well, that's an amazing way to end the evening, but I have to just say thank you so much for this far-reaching discussion.
Behind the book, I only gave you the highlights.
Right, and it, you know, really extraordinary beginning of what I think is the most important public policy issue of our day is really hunger. We can debate about everything else, but if we don't deal with the hunger problem, we're not the society we think we are, minimally, and this is the thing that we need to focus on, I think. And I really want to thank you, Joel Berg, for coming today.
Thank you.
And sharing your experience and your insights with us. And
Roar, lions, roar.
we hope to have you back. Thanks.